Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Alexandria Russell, and I am the postdoctoral fellow for the Scarlet and Black Project here at Rutgers University. We've had some really great panels earlier today, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our keynote address of our virtual symposium. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our program moderator for tonight, Scarlet and Black Project co-chair, Dr. Deborah Gray White. Professor White is Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, New Jersey. She is author of Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves, 1894 to 1994, several K through 12 textbooks on United States history, and Let My People Go, African Americans 1804 to 1860. Her edited work, entitled Telling Histories, Black Women in the Ivory Tower, is a collection of personal narratives written by African American women historians that chronicle the entry of Black women into the historical profession and the development of the field of Black women's history. Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans, a co-authored college text, is in its third edition. As a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and as a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, White conducted research on her newest book, Lost in the USA, American Identity from the Promise Keepers to the Million Mom March. She holds the Carter G. Woodson Medallion and the Frederick Douglass Medal for Excellence in African American History. Welcome, Dr. White.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start with a quote. The call to remember revolves around the very human need to tell stories of our past in order to preserve our present and secure a future. The demand for acknowledgement is born of the circumstances that show us that Black lives have always mattered, but have been taken for granted, unquote. These are the words of our speaker this evening, Dr. Jonathan Scott Holloway. Dr. Holloway is uniquely qualified to speak to us this evening about the university and the history of African Americans, for he is a renowned historian of Black life in this country. Among his books are Confronting the Veil, Abram Harris Jr., E. Franklin Frazier, and Ralph Bunche, 1919 to 1941. Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory and Identity in Black America since 1940, and his newest book, The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans. His numerous edited works, book introductions, articles, and presentations demonstrate his deep engagement with African American history. He delves into the weeds, so to speak, and has demonstrated a profound knowledge of Black intellectual life. He's received numerous honors for his work. They are, in fact, too numerous to name. He received an American Book Award for Jim Crow Wisdom and was a Hubert Humphrey Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I guess I should highlight the fact that Dr. Holloway is president of Rutgers University. Before taking this position, he was dean of Yale College and provost of Northwestern University. This makes his accomplishments as a scholar all the more impressive for anyone who has done administrative work and kept up their academic writing. Is truly a force of nature to behold. This is just not an easy thing to do. So this evening, it is my overwhelming pleasure to introduce you to President Jonathan Scott Holloway.
Thank you so much, Professor White. Just a sound check, I want to make sure you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can, yes.
Oh, okay, good. We have all been down this path on so many occasions. I want to start off on the right foot. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Professor White, for that really generous introduction. Tonight, I'm going to be reading from a paper that I've titled Invisible Narratives, Racial Specters and the Making of Institutions. I want to start my comments with thanks. Thanks to those who invited me to help mark this important occasion. Thanks to all of the speakers who are participating in this symposium. I've heard it's off to a great start. Thanks to everyone at Rutgers University Press for nurturing the 3-volume Scarlet and Black project. Thanks to all of the scholars who've contributed to this project since its founding and who will continue to work on the larger scholarly project examining race and its central role in this nation's history. Thanks to the Scarlet and Black editors, Deborah Gray White, Marissa Fuentes, Kendra Boyd, and Maya Carey. And most importantly, thanks to those people, functionally erased until the Scarlet and Black project started to produce its findings. Thanks to those people whose labor built this university, whose ideas shaped its culture, and whose activism reflected a faith that Rutgers could become better. Even though I cast a sober eye toward the past, I am by default someone who believes that hope springs eternal. It is a conscious choice, this hopefulness. Frankly, some days it's the choice I must remind myself to take if I want to get out of bed. Given the audience assembled here on this occasion, I don't think I need to belabor the point and explain why. I mention my commitment to hopefulness because instances like this, the well-deserved celebration of the publication of the 3rd volume of Scarlet and Black, make that commitment easier to keep. The ease of this commitment is not because the contributors to this volume tell one celebratory story after another. No, quite the contrary. The authors explore difficult truths in Rutgers' recent history as Black students push for recognition in academic, social, and cultural spaces. These are histories of resistance on both sides of the equation that have played a critical role in shaping our present. They are hard to read because they speak to real moments of broken faith, of administrative foot-dragging, and of cultural shaming. But I fervently believe that the more we tell these stories, the more we are open about uncomfortable things in our collective past, the easier it will become to navigate our way toward a future where equity and inclusion are hallmarks of our daily life and are understood as strategic advantages in large and small institutions as we lurch forward together toward the mid-21st century. Tonight, it is in this spirit that I offer a series of vignettes that span several centuries and that speak to the important role that history plays in helping us think clearly about the spaces that we occupy. Taken together, these stories, operating at grand and intimate scales, speak to the powerful ways that race and racial thinking are encoded and operationalized. This encoding and operationalizing have typically been done quietly, even invisibly. Indeed, it is their spectral quality that is the most important thing to acknowledge in trying to understand their effectiveness. After all, while it is hard to catch sight of ghosts, we all know that their presence can be felt, even though we often want to doubt their existence. First vignette, race, memorials, and nation making. God wills us free, man wills us slave. I will as God wills, God's will be done. These are the opening lines that you will find on a headstone marking John Jack's grave in a Concord, Massachusetts cemetery. These are also the words that I encountered every day of my childhood when I walked downstairs to the family basement. At the landing of the staircase, I saw a large charcoal rubbing of the John Jack headstone. I knew that my mother did this charcoal rubbing in the early 1970s when the family lived at Hanscom Field Air Force Base near the cemetery, but that was the extent of my knowledge, or even my curiosity. Then in late summer 1990, as I was loading my car for my move to New Haven for graduate school, I passed by the rubbing one more time. For some reason, I still don't know why, I stopped and read the full epitaph. Pardon me, I need to multitask here. I'm going to share my screen. For some reason, I stopped and read the full epitaph. God wills us free, man wills us slave. I will as God wills, God's will be done. Here lies the body of John Jack, a native of Africa who died March 1773, aged about 60 years. Though born in the land of slavery, he was born free. Though he lived in a land of liberty, he lived a slave, till by his honest though stolen labors, he acquired the source of slavery, which gave him his final emancipation and set him on a footing with kings. Though slave to vice, he practiced those virtues without which kings are but slaves. I was mesmerized. Jack, obviously not his birth name, was born in Africa, somehow captured and sold into slavery. He ended up in Concord, owned by Benjamin Barron, a cordwainer. Barron taught Jack the trade and allowed him to keep a portion of his earnings. In 1761, Jack purchased his freedom and even bought a modest farm. This is a powerful and perhaps even heroic story in and of itself, but as it turns out, this is only the beginning of the story. Being male and now being a property owner, Jack filed a petition to become a citizen of Concord. He had checked off the critical boxes. His petition, however, was denied. The rationale for the denial grew from the fact that he had once been in bondage. The date is critical, 1773. Jack was making this petition in the years leading up to the American Revolution, specifically in Concord, to citizens who were actively complaining to King George III that their citizenship rights were being denied, and moreover, that they were being treated like slaves. The fact that white propertied citizens of Concord could not see the irony of their declaration had to be strikingly painful to John Jack. He was powerless to do anything more about this bitter pill while he was alive, but with Jack's death, the epitaph on his headstone took on a life of great meaning. And this is where the story gets unusually interesting. As he was dying, John Jack hired attorney Daniel Bliss, a loyalist to the British Crown, to put his affairs in order. The first thing Bliss did was write the epitaph that would be chiseled into the headstone that marks Jack's final resting place. Bliss, the brother-in-law to Concord's patriot pastor, Reverend William Emerson, was appalled by the hypocrisy of the Concord citizens and made his anger known on more than a few occasions. Even though he came from a family of slaveholders himself, Bliss found value in John Jack's life, and in his death raised that life to the level of allegory. As Edmund Morgan argued in his classic book, American Slavery, American Freedom, and we can see it here in this headstone, we cannot understand the colonists' fevered love for freedom without understanding that the germ of this love, the illness perhaps, was slavery. There are also the double helixes of theft and labor, vice and virtue, the common man and the king. When I would start my lecture course on post-emancipation United States history, I would begin this epitaph and focus on these dualities. I would emphasize the metaphorical value of the language and explore what that language contributes to a nuanced understanding of that which was unacknowledged at the moment of the Declaration. It is the unacknowledged that gave value to the meaning of freedom. I'm not alone in finding value in this epitaph. In 1902, antiquarian George Tolman offered the following fulsome assessment. I think I am not extravagant in calling it the most famous epitaph in America, and in saying that no other one, whether of statesman, scholar, or soldier, artist or poet or philanthropist, has been so widely copied or read by so many people as has this that marks the grave of an obscure and nameless Negro. Tolman found evidence of Bliss's opening lines being copied and shared as early as 1775, in the first instance, a British soldier's letter home. To Tolman, the epitaph and its subsequent influence on the politically engaged was remarkable. He declared, "This epitaph of an American slave by an American Tory is the oldest of anti-slavery utterances, the first statement that I have been able to find anywhere of the fundamental thesis of the later abolitionists, that slavery is in itself a sin." Now, it is true that abolitionists took up Bliss's words and spread them broadly. The epitaph was printed in William Lloyd Garrison's The Abolitionist in 1833. In 1855, 3 years before he would organize a Crispus Attucks Day memorial celebration in Faneuil Hall, the Black abolitionist William Cooper Nell proudly wrote of the epitaph that, quote, "This single production will secure to its author forever the credit of taste, ingenuity, and an enlightened moral sense, and proves that sound abolition sentiments were cherished then as strongly as the present day." In her book, Black Walden, Slavery and Its Aftermath in Concord, Massachusetts, historian Elaine Lemire confirms that later generations found great value in John Jack's epitaph and used it as an early example of abolitionist rhetoric. But the abolitionists' consumption, reproduction, and circulation of Bliss's epitaph were divorced from Bliss's original intention. Lemire writes, "The little of conquered slave history that was still visible by the middle of the 19th century was commandeered by local abolitionists who reshaped the past until it was in line with their own commitment to emancipation. Local officials replaced John Jack's toppled gravestone in the 1830s, and a local abolitionist woman carefully tended the gravesite, planting flowers there. By then, it was possible to read John Jack's epitaph not as the indictment of patriots' hypocrisy Daniel Bliss intended, but as an assertion that Concord was the birthplace of abolitionism." Tolman's claim that this was the first statement that I have been able to find anywhere of the fundamental thesis of the later abolitionists was, to Lemire, a bold misreading that has been held ever since. Lemire's assertion that Bliss's intention was fundamentally about highlighting patriots' hypocrisy rings true when we consider the intensity of Bliss's Tory sympathies and the fact that he had to flee Concord and start his life anew in Canada when it was discovered that he had harbored British spies in his house. But these matters are beside the point. Instead, it is the abolitionist misinterpretation and then appropriation of Bliss's words that are important. And while we can admire Bliss's eloquence, it is in the act and consequences of misinterpretation that we find the epitaph's true value. John Jack's story and Daniel Bliss's epitaph help us understand that words like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness resonate differently when they are spoken by those who have been denied access to them. This denial is a perfect articulation of what many consider the bad faith resonating at the heart of the American experiment. The ability of this denial to vault itself above bad faith into a place of innocence and celebratory virtue is nothing short of remarkable. On a day when we are celebrating the publication of the third volume of a series dedicated to Rutgers history, why a story about a Concord, Massachusetts cemetery? Even though these events happened in colonial New England, we can read Rutgers into this story. John Jack was petitioning the citizens of Concord at the same time that Queens College was established in New Brunswick. As the contributors to Scarlet and Black have made clear, in volume 1, it should say, the same dynamics of unfree labor, invisibility, and building, in one case a nation, in another a university, were present in both places. It's also a Rutgers story in a very small way. The charcoal rubbing that my mother made in 1971 remains in my life. I took it with me when I left to go to graduate school with my mother's endorsement. In fact, that charcoal rubbing is now hanging prominently displayed in the president's office at Rutgers University. It is a personal reminder of my mother's love for history, but it also represents something larger, the narrative of what goes into the making of institutions that we often call home. Second vignette, fast forwarding centuries, race, labor, and institutions. In 2015, protests erupted across the nation's campuses, ignited by a specific series of events at the University of Missouri, but also connected to systemic failures of institutions, from police forces to universities, to recognize the humanity, much less the existence of Black bodies. In the university setting, Black scholars and students' critical assessments about the consequences of institutional failures of recognition are important and force a reconsideration of how universities might articulate themselves and their visions while serving all members of the respective communities. There is a troubling undercurrent, however, in the statements and conversations involving Black intellectuals and students. Too often they exist at a remove from another key constituency on college campuses, the constituency whose labor enables them to do their work. At a place like Yale University, situated in a post-industrial Black majority urban setting, with a service workforce that is predominantly Black and increasingly Latino, the historic and even contemporary failure to recognize that labor leads to low morale, workplace tension, and sometimes something more disruptive. Enter Corey Minifee, a Black dining hall worker at Yale who was assigned to Calhoun College, one of the university's 12 undergraduate residential colleges. Calhoun was named for Yale alum John C. Calhoun, 19th century South Carolina political statesman, slave owner, and intellectual architect of Southern secession. At the start of the 2015-2016 academic year, the name of the college had become a lightning rod for campus debates about honoring the past and acknowledging structural racism and inequality. Part of the controversy was in regard to windows found in the college's public spaces that depicted representations of an idyllic South, visions of a sporting man's life, South Carolina flora and fauna, enslaved persons' quarters, a Black man contentedly playing a banjo, and two enslaved individuals standing in a vast cotton field with baskets of picked cotton on their heads. This is an image of John C. Calhoun, statesman. I should say a picture that I took since I was, as the language was of the time, the master of Calhoun College. You can unpack that later. And this is not a high-res photo. It's the best I have of the two enslaved people working in the fields. Corey Minifee. Minifee was working in the dining hall where half a dozen of these images were etched in glass 15 feet above the floor. Minifee had been working in Calhoun for less than a year, but in early July, he had had enough. He climbed atop a table and used a broom to smash the window depicting enslaved people carrying cotton. As he told reporters, something inside me said, you know, that thing has to come down. You know, it's a picture. It was a picture that just, you know, as soon as you look at it, it just hurts. You feel in your heart like, oh man, like here in the 21st century, you know, we're in a modern era where we shouldn't have to be subjected to these primitive and degrading images. This is the recovered, this is again the image that was before it was smashed. And this is what was recovered by curators at Yale and restored to the best of their ability. After Minifee destroyed the window, he was arrested, lost his job. He was reinstated after a 5-week suspension and quickly became the rallying cause of protest marches in the city and the center of a media storm. The protests focused upon the structural inequalities of the moment, declaring that a wealthy, predominantly white university with a majority Black service workforce had fired a heretofore unknown worker because he refused to abide by the university's decision to honor a 19th century racist. The intensity of the media attention was predictable given the contemporary national climate regarding race and citizenship and violence, as well as the unrest on Yale's campus in the months leading up to Minifee's action. The scope and durability of the attention, this was a trending story for over a week in mainstream national news, were equally predictable and remarkable. Predictable for the reasons cited above, and remarkable for the way that they implicitly underscore Minifee's unacknowledged existence until the moment of convulsive recognition. Minifee's actions, of course, need to be placed in their proper historical context. Black service workers from earlier eras who engaged in these kinds of declarative actions knew that they would never garner sympathetic national media attention and at best would merely lose their jobs. These earlier workers had to know that an act of self-declaration like Minifee's would never compel an institution to acknowledge their full and complex humanity. It is safe to say that for decades, service workers' silence and invisibility were part of the code of cultural conduct that allowed Yale and similar schools to function comfortably within their own homogeneity. One image tells this story well. Here, a single Black worker, in this case a bartender, stands at silent attention in the middle of an idyllic 1950s scene. Dozens of older white men, a sprinkling of undergraduates, all male, all white, and a handful of older white women fill in the scene, drinks in hand. The unidentified bartender may have completed his work, but he must remain at attention, ready to pour another cocktail, ensuring that the party continues without interruption. His presence is fundamentally unrecognized, and until that glass is drained, it's safe to presume his labor also proceeds without recognition. While this image does not tell a story of a convulsion like Corey Minifee's, and even though there is no record of the service worker's name or history, the composition of the image and the story that it tells is piercing. There is no way to look at this image and not see a kind of psychological violence at work. In the fall before Corey Minifee had had enough, student activists at Princeton raised their voices in protest. The object of their activism was Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, the 34th Governor of New Jersey, and 13th President of Princeton. As the individual largely recognized for elevating Princeton's academic standing and reputation, Wilson's name was connected to or adorned places of prestige throughout the campus. The Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, Woodrow Wilson College, the Woodrow Wilson Award, the Woodrow Wilson Professorship of English, the Woodrow Wilson Scholars Program in the graduate school, and so on. In each instance, deploying Wilson's name was a marker of excellence and high esteem. What was lost in this marking of excellence was the fact that Wilson's racial views left much to be desired. He was committed to keeping Blacks out of Princeton when he led the school. Later, when he was President of the United States, his administration segregated the federal workforce and radically diminished the Black professional class in the District of Columbia for decades to come. Student activists were dismayed that the university seemed unconcerned by the troubling aspects of Wilson's legacy and felt that this lack of concern was manifested in a failure to recruit and support students and faculty from underrepresented minority groups. For these students, 21st century Princeton was not sufficiently different from the Princeton over which Wilson presided. While this was a clear oversimplification, the trustees recognized that there needed to be a much more robust accounting of Wilson's complex legacies, and thus created the Wilson Legacy Review Committee. This committee was charged with considering how the university should assess Wilson in light of the effect he had on the university structure, his accomplishments after he left Princeton, and the ways in which his commitment to a racial hierarchy was out of line with the university's modern vision. Even though some students declared that Princeton had not substantially changed since Wilson's era, the fact of the matter is that the university had changed significantly, if belatedly, in measurable ways. Measurement in this case was mostly related in terms of demographic change over time. Women, racial, sexual, and religious minorities, international students, all were now regular members of the Princeton community. However, the vestiges of earlier ideologies lingered. And it wasn't just about Woodrow Wilson. His name was merely the most prominent and easily attached to a set of values that the university no longer admired in full. The Wilson Legacy Review Committee acknowledged its dynamic and made it clear that it was committed to a university that was diverse, welcoming, and inclusive. While the committee ultimately recommended that Wilson's name remain attached to the various buildings and awards, this has since evolved since I wrote this, it declared that Princeton was obliged to be a better and more honest steward of its own history, acknowledging the complexity in Wilson's legacies, particularly those aspects of his worldview that were no longer aligned with the university's values. Understandably, when talking about the Princeton community, the report chiefly focused upon the student and faculty experiences. It also pointed to alumni and staff. This last group, however, merited the least amount of attention, garnering only 6 mentions compared to the 17 times that references to alumni appeared. Further, when talking about staff at the university, the report essentially alluded to the contributions of administrative staff. One imagines this group being comprised of administrative assistants, research technicians, and advisors. Gone unmentioned were the staff who tended the lawns, cooked the meals, emptied the garbage cans, and fixed the plumbing. While I do not have the racial demographics of this part of the Princeton community, it is a safe bet that African Americans are, at minimum, disproportionately represented in that population. And here we get to know artist Mario Moore, who was a Hodder Fellow at Princeton in the 2018-2019 academic year. While in residence, Moore decided to paint 10 blue-collar Princeton workers, a recognition of his own father's efforts to support the family when he was growing up in Detroit. Importantly, all of Moore's subjects are Black, a hearkening to the long struggle for job opportunities and equal pay. Moore's work is a declaration that if Princeton aims to wrestle with the complexities in its own past, it would do well to have an honest reckoning of the unacknowledged work that literally built the university and kept it running. This was work that Wilson would not have recognized at Princeton or when he was in the White House. Indeed, one of the difficult truths about Woodrow Wilson's legacy is that his decisions shaped a world around him that he never saw and did not deign to imagine. Third and final vignette, race and identification. The last of my vignettes focuses on another university president, me. On January 19th, 2020, news of my impending appointment leaked to the press. For the next 48 hours preceding my official introduction to the Rutgers community, one story after another spoke about the fact that finally, after 254 years, Rutgers would have its first Black president. Newspapers also made note of the fact that I played football at Stanford with New Jersey Senator Cory Booker. If one merged the headlines from all of the articles that ran in those 2 days, you'd find a few keywords standing out. Black, African American, first Black, and some phrasing that involved football. The consistency of the representation was such that one of my friends became furious. "I'm waiting for the story," he said, "when they point out that you can read and write too." I had a chuckle about his observation, but I found myself wondering some version of this as well. 2 days later, my appointment became official with more stories appearing in the papers. It was intoxicating. In the intervening month, a lot of work was happening behind the scenes to smooth my transition to Rutgers. Movers, benefit packages, email accounts, computing equipment, and photographs for my university ID card. Everyone was taking exquisite care of me, even while they were navigating through the uncertainties that accompanied COVID-19's arrival. We pulled into the driveway of our new home in late June. Everything was in order. I woke up the next morning still trying to process the swirl of events that brought me and my family to Rutgers. Before drawing any grand conclusions about this new life, something much mundane had to happen. I had to walk the dogs. Given their anxiety about the move, it was important to get them acquainted with their new neighborhood, so I loosed up the dogs and set off to see what we could of Bush campus. Before we left the house, I made sure to give myself a pat down. Did I have everything I needed for the walk? Dog bags, etc. But did I have my Rutgers ID card? Even though no one was around, again, a pandemic campus, I needed the security of that ID card. I wasn't worried about anything while I was on the property grounds or when I left the property, but I had no idea what to anticipate when I returned home, knowing that I'd be passing signs, that said Rutgers, private residence, and cameras for safety. Having all of 12 hours of experience on campus, I had no idea how closely the house was monitored, but the signs offered a narrative that told me that until I got to know campus security and police, or rather until I felt confident that they recognized me, that Rutgers ID was protection. I knew that the Rutgers gear I was wearing wasn't going to be of much value, as anyone could acquire that kind of mask. I knew my dogs, much as I loved them, would be worthless too. The only good thing about taking the dogs out on those quietly anxious first days is that my face and body would begin to circulate among those who might be wondering who I was. Also, those walks gave me the opportunity to rehearse exactly what I would say and how I would act when I was stopped. I made sure to keep my card in the front pocket of my jeans. No reaching around to the back to pull it out. I was ready. Is this madness? Does a slow-walking 53-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and 2 overly social yellow Labrador retrievers represent a threat to the community? I don't think so. But the president's house wasn't built for me. Perhaps in a different day, it was built by me. But its history suggests that it definitely wasn't built with me in mind. I quote from a pamphlet I found when I moved in. The president's house was built in 1929 for a member of the Johnson family, Roberta J. Nicholas, and her husband, Robert C. Nicholas, president of a Maine hosiery manufacturing company. Both the Nicholas and Johnson families were friends of Rutgers. The house was originally named Glen Liver and was constructed at a cost of about $100,000, 1929. In 1936, when the owners decided to move to Arizona to retire, the house came on the market. A group of members of the Board of Trustees raised money privately in order to present the house to the university as a gift that would provide an appropriate residence for presidents of the university to live and entertain on behalf of Rutgers. Now, let me be clear. The president's house at Rutgers is a lovely thing, easily the most beautiful and stately place I've ever lived. Further, my wife and I have felt well tended to in the house from the moment of our arrival. I also want to make clear that I've only had positive experiences with the Rutgers security and police when they've had to come to the house because of a faulty alarm that kept summoning them. And when I walk around the campus, with or without the dogs, I'm greeted by cars that slow down, not in a dangerous way, but so people can wave and even chat. But that ID card, it stays with me because history has made it clear in ways large and small, in ways loud and quiet, that even as the university president, I can only control but so much of the narrative. On more occasions than I should admit, I've envisioned a different set of newspaper stories than those that announce my impending appointment. The ones that I see aren't morbidly dramatic, but the narratives suggest close calls. Rutgers president stopped while entering his own property. Rutgers president arrested in case of mistaken identity. Police apologize, saying Rutgers president fit the profile. Those headlines, ghosts that don't exist, still haunt me from time to time as I walk around a campus that, by my job title, is mine to protect and serve. And even though I've been warmly and consistently welcomed since I've arrived at Rutgers, I know enough about how narratives are fashioned and how they shape culture and beliefs and give birth to alternative facts. Yes, I know how institutions are made in the United States. Further, I know for whom they were made. And while I have been witness to so much progress in my lifetime and have personally benefited from that progress, I know I need to keep that ID card close because, well, I know how institutions are made in the United States. Thank you so much.
Dr. Holloway, thank you so much for that. Very moving, particularly the last vignette. And it certainly situates us in this particular moment in time. So I'm going to ask those of us who, Dr. Russell, I'm going to expect that we're going to be getting some questions, and I'm going to solicit them. Does anyone that maybe I should talk to Dr. Russell and see whether or not anyone has put any.
Yes, we have one question right now in the Q&A tab, and I will bring her up so that she can ask it live. Just one moment.
As you envisioned what it meant to be president of Rutgers, I am wondering if and how the legacies uncovered by the Scarlet and Black Project and projects like it shaped your vision for the institution. In particular, what ways can the project be leveraged to continue to center the labors of members of the RE community that remain on its margins?
Thanks for that question. So when I was a candidate when I put my name in the hat, I'm sorry, let me back up. When I was considering putting my name in the hat to be considered as a potential president, I did my research, of course. I was wanting to do just basic dives into Rutgers and how it told its story. I already knew about the strengths of the history department and within African American studies and English lit. I mean, those are the areas I know best. So that wasn't a question. But like, how did Rutgers tell its story? And I remember, and I didn't know about Scarlet and Black. I didn't know about the 250th anniversary. I didn't know the connections. So I found myself on a website, and the first thing I saw that, stopped me in my tracks was this celebration. This is the fall of 2019, remember, of Paul Robeson on the centennial of his commencement. And I had no idea that Rutgers had decided to reclaim Paul Robeson in any sort of way. Because for a long time, the institution didn't want anything to do with Robeson. And I discovered that had been a work in progress for a while, but new to me. And then I discovered a whole series, Scarlet and Black, and then naming practices, Will's Way, the walkway outside of Old Queens, that was about reclaiming history of who literally built the campus. discovered the newest apartment complex called Sojourner Truth. And I found myself saying, what is going on here? You all may feel that is fairly normal to you at this point, recent history, but that is so different from my experiences in higher ed in terms of a very serious and open engagement. Now, schools are doing that now. This is in the last couple of years, schools are doing it. But I've been in higher ed for 30 years, and the approach prior to the most recent last handful of years was really let's only tell our best story. Let's not worry about these things in the past. Let's try to keep it behind a curtain. What I found about Rutgers is that I was struck that this place had a maturity about it in talking about these issues, that it was a scholarly conversation based on great research that was saying, this is who we are too. This is part of what makes Rutgers. So to me, that was quite shocking. It was actually one of the reasons that contributed to me deciding to put my name in the hat. The idea of being at a place that took its past seriously, warts and all, was exciting. Now, oh boy, now I've really lost track of the first part, other part of your question. I think it was about how does this translate into, you're gonna have to forgive me, I'm sorry, Beatrice, can you come back and tell me the other part of your question?
Hi, I'm back. The other part of the question was about how this history can continue to be leveraged to help people who are part of the RU community who continue to be marginalized.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I thought it was connected to the present day. And so the one thing is that we have to keep telling this story. And so when I, somewhere in my first few months as president, I was circling back to Scarlet and Black, and I knew that there was this project. I mean, I guess in my first press conference, I received questions about the name of the university, the name of certain buildings on campus. And I found out that there had been the intention to do a study of the naming of certain buildings on campus. I'm like, well, what happened to it? Like, well, it kind of got stalled out. I'm like, unstall it, please. So it became really important that we engage the Scarlet and Black Committee again, as we did, to think seriously about putting up historical markers on other places on the campus, a project that is now happening. I am not going to be at a university that is scared of its own shadow. And I'm not going to be at a university that is unwilling to talk about the work that has gone into making it and that continues to go into making it. And so for me, as the institution's leader, one of my jobs is to tell this story, to tell these kinds of stories. I think that we are a remarkable country, far from perfect, because of the stories of the people that have been erased. And that we need to bring those stories. That's the arc of my entire career, and Professor White's and so many of yours as well. I think we are in a remarkable institution because we are now telling these stories, and I will continue to do so. And in telling those stories, I'm telling the students, underrepresented students, staff, and faculty, hey, this is your place. And that may seem like a small gesture, but I think it's a really important gesture because so many people receive the message that they don't belong. To me, that's unacceptable. And so I've been doing a lot of outreach this year with, forgive me if I get the name wrong, United Black Council, other Black student organizations, Black Alumni Association, the Black Alumni Association, and meeting with people in Africana Studies, meeting with a BIPOC coalition of faculty. I'm trying to get out as much as I can to make it clear that this place is theirs. And then from an institutional standpoint, aside from doing an equity audit, creating a senior vice president for equity, that's a cabinet level position reporting to me, working together with some leaders on Rutgers campus, we were able to secure a major gift from the Mellon Foundation to create the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, a research-driven enterprise that goes from New Brunswick to Newark to Camden, bringing together some of our really great thinkers on this area and using it as a vehicle to amplify the voices that are already speaking in this regard at Rutgers and to bring in more people into the conversation and to create postdoctoral funding opportunities So frankly, we can catch people at the right moment in their career that they might become part of the Rutgers community. So this is about being unafraid of our past, making sure that people recognize that this place belongs to them too, no matter where they're coming from. And then from the standpoint of the research enterprise, making it clear that this area of inquiry, larger area of inquiry of social justice and racial justice, is a central part of who we are. Sorry, it's a super long answer, but it was a big question. And it's important to hear all the different ways in which I've come to this thinking, I think at least.
Okay, so we've got quite a few questions in our Q&A box.
All right, I'll be fast.
Okay, the next question comes from Kendra Boyd, who actually one of our editors, and one of our researchers. Do you want to? Is your mic unmuted so you can ask?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, President Holloway, for your insightful words tonight. I wanted to ask you if you have any advice for Blacks in academia who do have to deal with microaggressions. You mentioned that, you're the president. You pretty much can't go any higher than that. And then you still have to worry about people assuming you don't belong or you're not who you are. So for someone who's pretty early in my career starting out, what advice do you have for navigating that and knowing that that's what you're up against as you move through academia?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important question, and it's a hard question. I mean, the answer is hard. It's not easy. I mean, the fact is, I'm not making up. I carry that. I think probably now I don't carry the idea because everybody seems to know me in this part of campus. But I am very conscious as I walk around the university, aware that at any moment something might go sideways. That's called being Black in America, and of course, and also being Black in higher ed. I wish I had the secret to answer the code that breaks. You know what I'm trying to say. The secret to breaking that code. I don't. I mean, what I have done is really believed in allies, sought them out, mentors who looked like everybody, but who are really committed to the idea of supporting faculty from underrepresented minority groups. I have been insistent as I moved towards administration that as I grew my own teams, that I was driven by a pursuit of excellence, and that when people asked questions about why excellence looked like, oh, well, you've hired another Black person, I'm like, I've hired another excellent person, and really push back in ways that are polite, but really quite clear that people need to they need to hear themselves and what they are saying implicitly when they're making presumptions that people like you and like me should earn plaudits for being articulate. No, we shouldn't. We are articulate. That you and me should earn plaudits from like publishing an article. That's our damn job, frankly. I mean, so there's a way in which I guess you might say it's a bit of ego too. Like I do, and this is training from my parents. Like, this is my university, not as president. I mean, okay, sure. But as a member of the faculty, like, this is my place. And I've always found it important to walk around with that kind of, some will call it arrogance, I just call it confidence, even when the evidence suggests you should think otherwise. As I said early on in my talk, I choose to be hopeful. That is a hard thing to do sometimes, but I have to get out of bed. And I refuse to let people tell me I don't belong, even when the evidence suggests something different in their mindset. I don't know another way. It is like pushing that rock up a hill. I mean, I hate to say it. It's like pushing that rock up a hill.
We have another question from Donna Gustafson. Would you like to ask President Holloway yourself, or would you like me to read your question?
You could read my question if you don't mind, because I don't see it on my screen.
Okay, so she writes, I'm excited about your reference to the commissioned portraits of workers at Princeton. Would you consider Rutgers creating a collection of workers' portraits to augment the many portraits of trustees, past presidents, and esteemed faculty at Rutgers?
Thanks for that question. As it happens, Rutgers, prior to my arrival, so I want to give full credit, was started to do this on its own. Now, not portraits, that's a big difference, but photographs. So there was a project, and I'm forgetting, it has a specific name that I'm forgetting right now. And I stumbled across it quite by accident, which is sort of an issue that I think should be rectified. A member of IPO, gosh, I've already adopted acronyms, I'm forgetting what they stand for. Institutional Planning and Operations, let's just call it that. And these are the people who are, bus system, they fix things, they tend to the grounds. These are the workers of the university. A member of the administrative structure of IPO, and I don't know if it's because she saw the Princeton project at all, I don't know, but she started a photographic portrait project that is doing the same thing with beautiful narratives. I mean, it is a thing of beauty. I stumbled across it on a website, and during a team meeting with IPNO, I didn't know who the author of it was, but gave her credit for it, and said we need to do more of this. So yes, the idea of telling our story from the perspective of all of us, I'm fully on board with that. Now, what that looks like in a literal sense, I'll have to beg your patience because I've only been in 10 buildings on this campus, one of which I live in. I still have a lot to learn about the physical plan and how it looks, but absolutely, this is a great idea. And I will say, you have in the chair of the Board of Governors, Mark Engelson, someone who would think this is a brilliant idea as well. And this is also one of the reasons I felt compelled about this, because this is a person who understands the situation and is committed to solving these kinds of things.
Mark Schuster, would you like to ask your question? Well, let's see, he's typed it in, so I'll ask it. Still absorbing the authenticity of the last vignette and the horror. Dr. White this morning gave a great overview of the sin of the 8th colonial college, to quoting President Obama's American Convergences here. Dr. Holloway, please reflect on your current thoughts on the other end, speaking to our history of hitting below the belt academically.
Okay, there's a number of things going on there. Let me take a stab at it. I mean, one of the reasons that I got very excited when I decided to put my name in the hat, frankly, is I don't know if I ever told you this, Dr. White, but I knew who you were already as a vice chair of the search committee or co-chair. I can't remember the actual title, and but I didn't know who the other people on the committee were. Then I actually said, let me take a look at who is on this search committee. And I was floored. It was diverse in terms of trustees, governors, administrators, faculty, and students. And within that diversity of positions, it was deeply diverse. And I knew from all my years of working at Yale and Northwestern, places I love in different ways, I could not have assembled that kind of search committee. I couldn't have at that level. I thought, okay, something different is happening here. And that's like that America converges here. And that's certainly also in the spirit of, or I see that in the spirit of looking at the diversity that Rutgers has fostered over the years. Now, has it all been inclusive? No, I understand that. That's a work in progress. We must be more intentional about it. But I love the fact that Rutgers embodies, and this is a line I use often, and I say a line, I don't mean to be flip, I believe it. When I talk to donors, like Rutgers represents the democratic possibilities of this country. Democratic possibilities of this country. So I love the idea that Rutgers, if you're qualified, we don't care your language at home. We don't care what country you're coming from. We don't care if you're first generation or fifth generation. We don't care about your racial background. We just want you here. And so that's the part of American Converges here. Now, is about punching below our weight. There's a strange phenomenon about Rutgers, a place that I've always associated as a powerhouse research university, that has not been recognized in that same sort of way. Weirdly, in the further you get from Rutgers, I think its reputation enhances. I think there might be some sort of New Jersey psychology or psychosis about this. But if you leave the state of New Jersey, you'll hear people refer to Rutgers as a public Ivy. And it certainly had that reputation of Michigan, Virginia, Berkeley, North Carolina, Wisconsin. Rutgers is in that conversation. And what I don't understand is when I was applying for the job that Rutgers was ranked 22nd public institution in the country by US News. Now we can go on about ranking systems and that's a different conversation, but I'm like, there is no way that Rutgers is the 22nd best public institution in the country. I think it's really, around 10, hovering on either side of that or something like that. So what is it that has let us be ranked at that level? And it's because there's not been enough work of tending to our academic reputation and other aspects of what make us excellent. And one of the things that makes us excellent is that we are a university that is transformational. The social mobility index is one of the things that's fairly recently introduced to US News that tracks how universities do in taking someone from here and moving to some other place. Rutgers does a great job in that regard, but we have not been intentional about focusing on that and telling our story in that regard. So I want to take America Converges here. I want to take the academic excellence that's already here, bring them together. It's already there. I want to bring them together in a narrative, and then we can start telling a different story about this great place.
Well, this sort of is very related to the next question, which Dr. Erica Dunbar wants to ask. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Yes, go ahead.
I think I wrote that Dr. White, Dr. Fuentes, and the Scarlet and Black team have crafted a really important narrative about Rutgers and the past. And I'm wondering how you imagine writing our present and our future. Thank you.
And that's exactly the kind of eloquence I'd expect from you, Professor Dunbar. That's a great question. I think I hope you heard in my last response a bit of the answer. I was kind of bold, I think, probably with the Board of Governors when I was interviewing them, And I said that one of them, I'm close, paraphrasing, said, well, you've come from private institutions, which is true. It's like, we love Rutgers, believe in Rutgers, but why are you interested in Rutgers? I'm like, and my response was confusion. I'm like, because it's an excellent research university. I mean, why wouldn't I be interested in Rutgers? And then I said, and this points to this larger phenomenon about punching underneath its weight. I mean, we've got one heavyweight, sports metaphor, I'm sorry, but one incredible scholar after another, one, incredible student after another, but a weird reticence about bragging on it. Part of my job is to brag on it, to be quite honest. And part of my other job is to make sure the brag is not false, to make sure that people recognize that the things that I'm talking about, I'm proud of. That phenomenon of America Converges here, the democratic possibilities embodied in this place, are realized and experienced in a way where people don't feel damaged when they leave. And this is about, and that's part of why I did the equity audit. So we couldn't just say, hey, rah, 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 we're the most diverse school in the Big Ten. Well, depending on how you count it, we are or we aren't. It really depends. So let's be honest about who we are. Okay, diversity is great, but does that mean the experience is great also? Those two things are totally separate functions. So what can I do? What can I do to help instill in the administration of the university the expectation that we are going to deliver an environment where I don't care what you look like, thinking of a student perspective, you can be a student. Now, if you choose to add on your attributes of a Black student, a radical student, a X, Y, or Z student, that's great. But I don't want to have an environment where you are forced because of circumstance into a space because you're other, because you're other, because you're other. I want people to come here and feel that they can have the world, and frankly, that they deserve the world, and we need to deliver it to them. So that's part of what I want for the present and for the future of Rutgers. I mean, look, presidents don't stay presidents forever. So my ambition, I just started here, of course, I'm not going anywhere, but my ambition is to leave this place, when it's time for to leave this place, that people are comfortable telling a story about Rutgers' excellence in the academic space and in the student experience space, that they're comfortable telling a story about here's a place that wasn't left behind as the country changed demographically, that here's a place that was at the front edge of it and was a leader throughout higher ed of demonstrating how people can feel that this is their institution, that this is their place. Those are the things I want to leave as a legacy.
So we are fast approaching the time when this is going to end, and I think we have one more. We have a question. We have a couple of questions, but I think we're going to make the question from one of our very distinguished alumni, Bruce Hubbard, the last question. Mr. Hubbard, would you like to ask the question?
No, go ahead and ask it for me.
Oh, okay. All right. So Mr. Hubbard asked, can we support a Center for Black Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick, named after Paul Robeson, accessing across multiple cultural areas on the site of Ford Hall on College Avenue? Very specific question.
Yeah, is Ford Hall the place that's like 4 buildings attached to one another that's sitting empty right now? Is it a brick? I mean, this is me, the new guy that is still learning Rutgers. So,
That's correct.
Oh, okay, all right. That is extremely specific. Can we support the Center for Black Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick, named for Paul Robeson, accessing across multiple cultural areas on the side of the? I mean, I don't have any opposition to it. I do know that we just created this new institute for the study of global racial justice. I'm not keen. We'll see how that develops. I'm not keen to duplicating institutes and centers if we don't need to. So there might be some convergences there. Within the institute, there's a center on each campus, so that may be sort of overlapping in that kind of way. So that's one possibility. I know that Ford Hall, the only reason I know about it is because I've heard that it's a site of interest and controversy. From an architectural, from a use issue, it's actually a problematic building for deep inaccessibility and fire code issues. So it actually is empty right now. So I'm not going to make any commitment about Ford Hall one way or the other at this time. But the idea of what you're talking about, I think is absolutely worthy of the conversation. I'd like to see how the Institute evolves over the next year or so.
Actually, I think we do have time for another question. Joseph Williams, again, one of our researchers for the Scarlet and Black Project, would like to ask a question. Mr. Williams asked, how might you suggest faculty approach the topic of controversial historical markers in the classroom and among students? What does such a conversation look like in regards to curriculum and the ongoing cultivation of a new generation of scholars?
There's a lot of layers to that question. One of the things that people find, it's across higher ed, which is one of the challenges of higher ed, is that you have people, scholars who develop their area of expertise, they're amazing at it, and they stay in that space, who are really poorly equipped to know how to talk with students. I mean, this is about the diversifying of higher education. One of the reasons we have to be intentional and strategic about, from an administrative standpoint and from a curricular standpoint, or pedagogical standpoint, we need to educate our own faculty, not just about, I mean, I'm not even getting to the level of the controversial historical markers, but like how to talk to students who don't look like them, who don't come from their experiences. And it's an old problem in higher ed. I mean, a long-lasting problem, but it's still something we need to work on. Now, to your specific question, it is the answer, even as I'm saying it, feels incomplete. But this is what I'm saying. What I'm offering is that what I would tell faculty is to approach these conversations about controversial historical markers with humility. That seems like a strange thing to say, but professors are so used to being in charge of a room and telling the students, "Oh, this is the way it is." I think this is a moment where if professors step back from that perspective and really engage the students directly, trying to understand better where they are coming from something, and then played a bit of devil's advocate with them in a way that is not offensive, of course, but is pedagogically informed, that you could get in some interesting spaces. Now, let me be a little more concrete. When I was at Yale still, and they were going through a series of convulsions over the names on residential colleges and a number of other buildings on campus. And one of the narratives from student activists was that, and I'm oversimplifying, these names have to come down. We would have never named a building in honor of somebody like this ever. And these buildings, some of them were named, like Calhoun was named in 1933. And a historian colleague of mine, this is on a panel, said, well, let's slow down a second. We don't know, well, one, what you would have thought or said in 1933, cultural context shift over time. But historians need to be humble when they're dealing with the past. While it is tempting to go back and say, I would have never done X, Y, or Z, you don't know what you would have done necessarily. And the way he pointed to an example of this is like, in 30 years, probably less than that, people are going to look at us and say, you ate meat? You drove cars? I mean, you drove yourself? That there are things that you and I consider mundane. And in fact, since he asked that question, the notion of eating meat has changed radically just in 4 years. And the notion of what cars are going to look like has changed radically in just the last year. Things change quickly. So we need, I think scholars, professors in this case, need to bring a level of humility to the past and help their students bring humility to the past. Now, does not mean you get rid of your values. It does not mean you don't ask tough questions. It just means that you are committed to almost being what I'll call clinical or scientific about it. And this is what Scarlet and Black Committee has done in dealing with historical markers on campus. You've got to go down into the records to sort of unveil, well, it's like Russian nesting dolls and layers of onions and all these things, mixing all these metaphors together. The past gets messy and complicated and humbling. And so I would ask scholars to bring that humility with them when they engage students in these questions. And this is, I think, an issue where students and faculty can explore together and come to some really interesting and perhaps even bold conclusions.
Wow. We have actually come to the end of our session, and I really just want to thank you for being our keynote speaker this evening, for speaking so positively about Scarlet and Black, and really for accepting the office of the presidency of Rutgers University. Yes, I look forward to the next few years of working with you. Okay, and with that, I will invite you to tune in tomorrow for the continuation of this Scarlet and Black Symposium. Thank you for coming this evening.